So good afternoon, or good evening, I guess, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Michelle Au, and I'm a member of the Georgia House of Representatives for Georgia's 50th House District, which encompasses most of Johns Creek and a little sliver of Alpharetta here in the metro Atlanta suburbs of North Fulton County. So in serving my district, part of my mission has been not just to keep my constituents abreast of what's happening in the state legislature. You know that our legislative session just ended at the beginning of April, but also to add context in our national political landscape and how this environment affects Georgia. So I don't think that we've ever had a discussion as timely or frankly as urgent as the one we're about to have today. So this Tuesday, we marked the 100th day of the second Trump administration, which is a marker that's traditionally, at least in the press, triggered a look back on actions and accomplishments of a new presidency. Honestly, it's kind of hard to know where to start. I think it's fair to say that we've never in our lifetimes seen a presidency marked by the speed, the aggression, and frankly, the destructiveness we've seen in this second Trump term, as he and his administration really seek to remake and dismantle some of the foundational aspects of the US government. And with it, the very Constitution, he took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend. So here in Georgia, what we've seen since January 20th is the elimination of thousands of federal jobs, tariffs, and skyrocketing costs posing really existential threats to small businesses, destabilization of Georgia's top industries, including agriculture, manufacturing, and healthcare, and frankly, terrorization of our immigrant communities, attacks on our education system. And really, there's been no aspect of our everyday lives that's not been affected by the actions of this new administration since January 20th. And I think there's sometimes a danger in that, right? Because people sometimes get overwhelmed. In medicine, there's a term that we use specifically in pharmacology called tachyphylaxis, which refers to a phenomenon when repeated doses of the same medication starts to have a diminishing effect because the body becomes, desensitized to it. So the danger with an administration like this, whose actions are so broad and so aggressive and so unrelenting, is that people just become exhausted, frankly, right? And I get that these are dark, scary times in America right now, and there's a temptation to want to unplug and to tune it out and to hide from the worst of what's happening all around us. But that's exactly what this administration wants, because the worst things happen when Americans don't pay attention or when Americans show that they no longer care, right? So we're not going to let that happen. And the best weapon against apathy is education. So that's why we are here today. So today we're going to talk about the Trump administration, the limits of presidential power, and at least address the question I get asked the most often since January 20th, which is, can he do that, right? As an aside, this is for you, Jamal, as an aside to the nerds out there who will object to my grammar in phrasing this. Yes, I realize the question of can he do that has essentially been borne out, at least in this first round of actions, because yes, he can do that. He is already doing that. He has done that, right? But the broader question is, of course, may he do that? Does the Constitution allow for him to do that? And how best can we fight back with our knowledge, with our action, with our feet and our voices, and of course, at the ballot box? And I can think of no one better to help us answer this question than my friend and our guest tonight, Professor Jamal Green. Here's the part where I intro Jamal. So Professor Jamal Green is a constitutional law expert whose scholarship focuses on the structure of legal and constitutional argument. He teaches constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, the law of political process, First Amendment, and federal courts at the Columbia University School of Law. From January 2023 to December 2024, that's about 2 years, Professor Green served as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel in the U.S. Department of Justice. So that seems like as good a place to start as any, your most recent position before returning to Columbia. What is the role of the Office of Legal Counsel, and how does this experience inform your perspective on the actions of the current administration?
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to talk to this audience. I'm very happy to be here. The Office of Legal Counsel is the office in the Department of Justice that kind of authoritatively determines the law for the executive branch. So if there are really complex legal questions that any agency in the executive branch has, or if the White House has a complicated question, or the Attorney General, they turn typically to the Office of Legal Counsel to resolve it. And however that office resolves it is then binding on the executive branch. So it's what's referred to as the delegated authority of the Attorney General, meaning the Attorney General is the one who authoritatively decides the law of the executive branch, just internal to the executive branch. And the Attorney General, the office that does that for the Attorney General is OLC, or the Office of Legal Counsel. So imagine like the State Department has one view of the law and the Commerce Department has a different view of the law. How do they resolve that? When there are two agencies within the same government, they would go to OLC. So that's just one example, but there are lots of sort of complex legal questions that the office resolves.
So can you give an example of something? It doesn't have to be a real example. It could be a made up example of something that you would get asked as a Deputy Attorney General at the OLC to determine, and what you would do with that question and what happens after.
So there have been some high profile questions that you can sort of look up online. There's an American citizen abroad, and the president thinks that the person has ties to terrorism and wants to initiate a drone strike on that person. Does the president have the constitutional and legal authority to do that? That is the kind of question that would typically go to a lot of different agencies, but OLC would certainly be typically involved in answering that kind of question. And whatever answer OLC gave would be binding on the executive branch, binding on the Department of Defense, unless the president or the Attorney General overruled it, which is basically unheard of.
So, it's interesting because having worked at the OLC and watching the actions of this administration, and I know you can't know this in an absolute sense because you do say the president can overrule basically any advice that OLC would give him. But what do you think is happening right now? Because it seems like in order to bring a question to the OLC, you have to care that the question you're asking, you have to care about the outcome, right? You have to care, like, is this against the law? And it matters to me whether this is allowed. Do you think that process is even taking place now, or that
So I think it probably depends on the question, and you're very right in that the reason it's unheard of for the president to overrule OLC is because the president is not required by law to ask questions of OLC. And so if the president doesn't care what the answer is, there's no real reason to go to the Office of Legal Counsel, especially if they're going to give a different answer than the one the president is seeking. There's some evidence that, at least for certain things, the president has been bypassing the Office of Legal Counsel. One of the jobs that the office has is to review executive orders for what's called form and legality, meaning they are legally authorized executive orders and they take the form that executive orders typically take. They have the right grammar and the language is right. And there have been lots of executive orders that don't look like they went through the Office of Legal Counsel. They're sloppy, they are illegal, unlawful. They violate the Constitution. The very early in the administration, the birthright citizenship executive order that tried to strip birthright citizenship of a number of people who either don't have legal status in the United States or are here on tourist visas or student visas. That's unconstitutional. That never would have gotten, at least I'd be very surprised if that ever got through the Office of Legal Counsel. And so I don't think they're using OLC for the big decisions. But there are lots of little decisions that the executive branch makes every day. Every agency of the executive branch, makes dozens, hundreds of decisions that no one ever hears about, interpreting their authority under some particular law that will sometimes get to the Office of Legal Counsel. I don't have any reason to think that's not happening. Someone has to sort of turn the lights on and keep the trains running in the government. But that's sort of below the level of the big White House decisions that get headlines. And I think the evidence is that that's not really going through OLC.
We're going to get to that birthright citizenship executive order a little bit later in this webinar, but I wanted to start with some actions that have been brought up that people question the constitutionality of both the initial action and the subsequent actions of that primary decision. So we're going to talk about DOJ. It's basically what I'm trying to say. So, early in the administration, President Trump created DOGE, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, by executive order and tasked it with culling the new catchphrase that said all at once in a big stream, culling waste, fraud, and abuse and cutting government spending, right? So first of all, let me say, I think everyone can agree that decreasing waste, fraud, and abuse is a sound priority, right? I say that as a lawmaker, I say that as a citizen, as a voter, and especially those of us who work in government can agree that government really could stand to be more efficient, right? Like I work in that building, I get it, right? Like we could be more efficient, right? However, I think that many people who have concerns about DOGE have issues not so much with the stated goal, but its methods and its effects, right? And here in Georgia, what we've seen and felt is the effects of the massive and at times seemingly really like indiscriminate elimination of thousands of federal jobs, including felt most pertinently in the metro Atlanta area at the Atlanta-based Centers for Disease Control, which is really the crown jewel of the United States public health system, right? So the first most basic question I get asked by constituents about this is, can they do that, right? Like meaning primarily, first, can the president just create a new department by executive order? And you can see how I feel about this, but that I do the portentous air quotes, but can he create a new department just in writing an executive order and signing it with a Sharpie? It is a Sharpie, so it's a permanent marker. Second, can he just wholesale eliminate other departments or agencies by that same mechanism without congressional authorization? Is this legal? And if not, what are the mechanisms to challenge these actions?
So I think the quick and dirty answer is no and no. You can't just create
Okay,
departments.
webinar over.
Yeah, no, we're done. We're done. And he can't just create departments and eliminate and then eliminate government departments by fiat or executive order. There's a little bit more nuance to it, right? And which is, anyone who's kind of a law nerd or an executive branch nerd, when you hear the president created a department, you start to cringe because departments are created by Congress. Congress passes a law, and that law creates the Department of Energy or the Department of State or the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. The president can't create departments. Now, the president can create advisory boards and commissions that have advisors. And as far as I can tell, that's effectively what the so-called Department of Government Efficiency is, which is Elon Musk is an advisor to the president, just like the chief of staff is an advisor to the president, and the national security advisor, which I guess is now Marco Rubio, is an advisor to the president. But you can't create an entity that actually has legal authority just by the president deciding to do that, because we are a nation of laws, and what it means to be living under a constitution is that the government, even if it wants to do things, is constrained by law in the ways in which it does things. And so the president can't just decide to create departments and give them the authority to cut government programs and cut spending and cut waste and abuse, et cetera. They can give advice to people who do have that power, who have been given that power by statute. Now, can they eliminate departments? No, they can't do that either. The way in which this has been happening is through like firing lots of people and like not spending money that Congress has said they have to spend. Not spending money that's been appropriated by Congress is a kind of cardinal sin of abuse of it. It's like one of the core abuses of executive power, because it's the president taking the power of the purse, which is a core congressional power. Now, firing people, agencies can fire people, and sometimes they can fire a lot of people. There are mechanisms for doing that. There's something called a reduction in force, which is a legal mechanism for mass layoffs. The purpose of that is like there's a huge budget shortfall, or there's some kind of emergency, or there's a department that has no work to do, and so you're paying them to do nothing. So there are ways of reducing the workforce, but there are very, very specific requirements for how to do that. And by and large, the government, these agencies, and certainly DOGE, has not been going through that process. So for a number of these agencies, USAID, for example, has not gone through that process, as far as I'm aware.
So the one thing is in terms of firing the number of people that you need to cripple an agency, like, yes, you can maybe not eliminate the agency technically, but if you fire enough people and cripple it enough, it's not able to serve its purpose. So that, I guess, is one way around the technicality of a president can't by
Yeah.
fiat get rid of it. How,
And-
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and you had asked, how do you challenge this sort of thing? And there are a number of lawsuits challenging these eliminations of government employees. There's also an internal mechanism within the executive branch called the Merit Systems Protection Board that protects government employees against being improperly removed or disciplined. But the president is actually trying to, has purported to fire one of the members of that board to deny it a quorum so that the board can't review these actions. So just another way of trying to insulate the government from any accountability. But there are lawsuits, and part of the theory of some of these lawsuits is if you fire enough people and then stop spending the money, then you're effectively eliminating the agency, even if you don't, cross it out with a Sharpie necessarily. And so that'll be, part of the legal theory is, how far can you go to just almost literally refusing to take care that the law is faithfully executed, which is a constitutional command to the president. He's not, you're not taking care that the law is faithfully executed if the laws and agencies that are designed to implement the law are not staffed and aren't able to do their job.
Talk about USAID, which you mentioned. That seems a little bit different from firing a large number of people in an agency. That, so far as I understand, they actually eliminated that entirely. Is that, I understand that's being challenged in court, but it seems like one of the issues, and we can talk more about this, is that the mechanism for dealing with unlawful or unconstitutional actions by the executive branch is not well matched to the action, in that the action is quick and immediate and the courts are very slow, right? And so if that's the only, mechanism by which we can challenge it, it seems like those are not good oppositional, forces to work against each other.
Yeah, and that's been kind of the main functional mechanism because Congress, which does have some oversight power and does have some levers for affecting the behavior of the president, has been completely absent from caring that programs that it authorized through law are being dismantled. And yes, you're right that with USAID they kind of purported to dismantle it. They kind of said like, yeah, we're not doing USAID anymore, and they like took the name off the front of the building and said, everyone's got to go home. We're going to cut off the money. All of those things I think constitute ultimately illegal acts that they're being sued over. But to your point, there are people who aren't getting their medical supplies and people who are going to get sick and die. And while those lawsuits play out, and it's going to be very hard to reestablish both the actual workforces and the infrastructure and the trust that you need to operate in these environments. So a lot of the damage can be done well before you get to a court. And that actually makes me think, you asked sort of about OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel, and what one learns when one is there is, how much of what the executive branch does will never see a court, or if it does see a court, it'll be weeks, months, years after damage has been done. So courts are an important outlet and an important remedy here, but ultimately one has to affect the behavior of the president directly.
Yeah. So, the thing about all of this that's happening is, one thing you can say about Donald Trump, if I'm going to say, oh, this is a good thing, but it's a truthful thing, is that he is
Love the
doing
family.
telling the truth. One thing, he is doing exactly what he said he was going to do when he was on the campaign trail. And whether, the people who voted for him believed or understood the impact of those campaign promises or not, really, I guess, remains to be seen. But he has long promised to do exactly the kind of damage we're witnessing now, right? It's much easier to break things than to build things. And, he certainly is working fast. So that's a kind of thing, right? One thing I want to expand to talk about that many of my constituents are talking about, and I know that it's May 2nd now, so there's an action that's taking place today that is new related to this key initiative, which is imposing tariffs, right? which means everyone who is listening to this and cares enough to dial into this on a, Thursday evening knows this, but it means that companies that bring foreign goods into the US have to pay a tax to the government. And as a result, those companies tend to pass some or all of that increased cost on to customers, which is what we're facing now. The result of those Trump tariffs obviously are not just one-sided. Other countries will naturally retaliate in the nature of a trade war and charge reciprocal tariffs on goods imported from the US. I like how when Trump says reciprocal tariffs, he's like, reciprocal, that means when we do it, they do it. It's like someone got a word a day calendar. He read it. That's good. That's what reciprocal means. It's true. Georgia's leading export partners. So just to frame it for the state. So Georgia's leading partners are China, Canada, and Mexico. And our state ranks 7th in the nation for net exports, right? So some of our key imports, stuff we bring in to Georgia, include cars and car parts, right? We know we have a Hyundai plant that we're very proud of in this state and other car companies, computers and telecommunication equipment, and also pharmaceuticals like many common medications that we use every day. Those are our key top imports. Some of our key exports, what we ship out of Georgia, include things like cars, computers and telecommunication equipment, aerospace components, medical devices and equipment. I will notice I just went to a ribbon cutting in our district for Boston Scientific today. So that kind of medical device and equipment, and agricultural products like chicken and cotton and peanuts, right? So I said those two lists, the imports and exports, next to each other, and you'll notice that they have a lot of overlap. And I think this underlines the way that global trade is interdependent and the complexity of a system where components and manufacturing involve multiple steps that take place across multiple countries, each step of which will now incur an extra cost every time that good moves, right? And I'm going to tell you that I am hearing a lot of anxiety from my constituents, particularly small business owners who are finding it really difficult to plan for their futures or predict what's going to happen next. And I really can't tell them. I can't tell them what's going to happen next month, let alone what's going to happen tomorrow, right? So this includes, for my constituent, watching the ways that the uncertainty in the financial markets has decimated people's retirement savings. I'm not as close to retirement, so I'm just trying not to look, but certainly people who are closer to retirement or who just retired may not have time to recoup those losses that we're seeing, right? I'm also hearing a lot of frustration and anger towards members of Congress, which you noted, Professor Green, who seemingly have completely abdicated their responsibility or role to shape or halt Trump's destructive and careless, really frankly, very careless tariff policies, right? So my question here is to you, historically, what has been the role of Congress in imposing tariffs or tax policy, and what has been the role of the executive branch?
So I think it's fair to say that they've basically been partners over time, which is a pretty big difference from right now. So the Constitution directly, explicitly gives Congress the power to lay and collect imposts, so tariffs, and it gives Congress the taxing power as well. So that's very explicit in the Constitution, not given to the president, given to Congress. But over time, and especially in recent decades, Congress has delegated some significant authority to the president to impose certain kinds of tariffs. And the kind of run-of-the-mill tariffs that the president imposes are there's a whole process that you go through where the U.S. Trade Representative makes certain findings, or the International Trade Commission makes certain findings, and then the president can act on the basis of those findings, and it's typically something modest. What the president is relying on here is authority under a law called, we call it IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which gives the president some power to declare a national emergency and then pursue a number of economic measures, including potentially tariffs in the event of an emergency. So the president has declared a national emergency under the authority of this law in order to get around the ordinary process you'd have to go through to impose a tariff. So it's not totally unprecedented. It is unprecedented under this law, but there have been tariffs placed on the basis of a declaration of kind of emergency power that during the Nixon administration, that seemed to be a genuine fiscal crisis. Whereas here, it seems as though the president just likes tariffs. He sort of likes William McKinley, who imposed a bunch of tariffs, and he thinks that they're neat, and so he's declared a national emergency. I think this is an abuse of authority, an abuse of discretion, and it's being litigated in court right now. So there's no precedent for just sort of saying, I'm just going to go for it and pretend there's a national emergency so I can impose whatever tariffs I want. And you really, what you'd want to happen under these circumstances is, first of all, like a responsible president, but second, a Congress that steps in to try to claw back some of its own power.
What does he say the emergency is? Does he have to define the nature of the emergency?
Well, he seems to be under the impression that if other countries make money off of selling goods to the United States, that they're sort of pulling a fast one on us. Or so he keeps referring to how much money China is getting from selling things. When of course that's what happens when you sell things is you exchange them for money. And it's a well-known fact of sort of economic theory, right? That the fact that someone is selling us more goods than we are selling to them doesn't necessarily mean that we are suffering in some way. There is something called comparative advantage, right? Some countries are better at making some things, some countries are better at making other things. You get together and you exchange those things, or you exchange the inputs into you exchange parts of cars, and then we then send out the cars, right? That's like one of the possibilities. And so that's not an indication that there's some kind of crisis. That's just economics. But he's declared to be a crisis because he says that we're losing because we're getting a lot of things from other countries.
So you mentioned that Congress could take some actions to temper this executive action. What could they do? Pretend we have a working Congress. What is something that they could do?
Pretend we have a working Congress. So the first step they could do is this IEPA, this Emergency Powers Act, has a provision that says that Congress can end the national emergency by passing a joint resolution saying that there is no national emergency. And the Senate tried to do that recently, and it didn't pass, and it wouldn't have gotten through the House anyway, probably. There's an additional problem, though, which is that there's a certain constitutional law doctrine that says that Congress can't do what counts as lawmaking unless it actually presents it to the president. So if a law says that a joint resolution can end a national emergency, that law might very well be unconstitutional. And so you would actually need a veto-proof majority in order to end the national emergency. This is really problematic. It makes for a really dysfunctional process. So it becomes very hard to delegate power to the president because then you can never take it back. But that's what the Supreme Court has said. And so Congress would need 2/3 majority in each house of Congress in order to take this back without it getting a constitutional challenge. But even apart from that, that's sort of the legal avenue that you could take. But of course, tariffs cause economic distress and cause political distress, presumably, for people who support those tariffs and whose constituents are suffering through them. And so there are all kinds of ways that members of Congress can put pressure on the president and say, hey, help us out here. You're doing us harm. You're doing us political harm. And if necessary, can try to engage in oversight. So you call the Treasury Secretary to Congress to say, well, what's the basis for this? When is this going to end? You generate publicity. But Congress isn't doing any of that.
So it seems like the two mechanisms you're putting forth is that Congress could end the emergency, which seems like it's a pretty high threshold. So that's probably not going to happen just numerically, like by the math. Or the other thing is that it could become so painful for them that they could somehow convince the president to make a smart political or electoral decision to pull back on the tariffs. Are those the two options that we have?
Well, and I think when we're talking about Congress, I think it's things that have a very high threshold, so have to go through the president, or putting more informal political pressure on the president, or again going through the oversight process and publicizing, generating attention and generating eyeballs, which is an extremely important power of Congress. It can get the attention of the American people by holding a hearing. But there are other mechanisms potentially that don't go through Congress. Economic pain is painful, can be very painful for businesses who are not able to make profit if the cost of their imports is going way up. And so businesses have all kinds of ways of putting pressure on politicians as well. It's not clear exactly how much this president listens to most business people who aren't Elon Musk.
So would you think that maybe the best pressure point that people have as just like regular Georgians and voters is to go to their Republican Congress people and make it painful for them such that that pain is conveyed to their party leadership and adequately publicized?
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, I think that's right. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that this president listens to Democrats. And so yes, I think putting pressure on Republicans and really showing them that you care. I mean, you began the segment by talking about how important it is to show that you have not checked out of politics. And there are still political incentives in the world. And people do still respond to, or are capable of responding to pressure. And that's how our system, that's the ultimate backstop of our system, is showing that you care, showing that you're outraged, showing that you don't think it's acceptable for the president to both impose economic pain, but also, of course, do it in a way that abuses his authority.
Speaking of abuse of authority, which I guess this whole webinar is about, but I think you've probably heard this phrase way more than I do, even though I've heard it a lot too. But that phrase is a constitutional crisis. People have been throwing around, for a while now. And I tend to hear a lot of debate that feels very academic about what exactly constitutes a constitutional crisis, where we are on a scale of 1 to 10. It's like that pain scale that when you go to the hospital, it's like, which smiley face is how much pain you're in? Like on a scale of 1 to 10, on the crisis scale, where are we right now? What is the bright line that needs to be crossed for us to qualify to be in a constitutional crisis, et cetera, et cetera. And this is all, people love chit-chatting about this, right? And that's all well and good and high-minded and all that stuff. But again, I think back to that phenomenon of tachyphylaxis, of becoming inured to a stimulus. And the more we talk about it, the more it almost desensitizes us to the fact that all this is really highly abnormal. Everything that has happened since January 20th is very abnormal, right? And to me, when I think about this phrase constitutional crisis, and I'm not a lawyer, as anyone will tell you, definitely not a lawyer, but to me, I think it's almost too late, because in my mind, we are already there, and we've basically been there since day one. Because I'm going to harken back to something you noted at the beginning, which is, just hours after taking the oath of office, when he swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, Donald Trump signed an executive order to ban birthright citizenship, right, which is a constitutional right. So obviously, we're already there, because when a constitutional officer shows in their actions that they are not constrained by the laws or what the Constitution dictates at all, and when the corrective measures of the courts, again, are not just met by indifference, like he doesn't care what the courts say, he doesn't care what the law say, but actually defiance, right? Like outright contrarianism and defiance. Essentially, what the president is saying, looking at the Constitution, is like what, you gonna make me? Like, you and what army, right? Which is accurate, right? The Supreme Court does not have an army. So we are there. The crisis has happened already. We are living in the crisis, right? So, since day one, to bring it to our last topic, and frankly, every day since then, so much of this loss of constraints has been centered on the issue of immigration and even more fundamentally and more broadly, what it means to be an American and who belongs in this country, right? So what we're seeing in Georgia and across the country is we're seeing people getting deported without due process, right? We're seeing those people who are legal residents of this country who are here on student or work visas having those visas revoked for very spurious or thin reasons, right? This, in fact, just happened in Georgia, where international students at Kennesaw State, Emory, and UGA lost their student visas that gave them the right to stay and study here, right? These students, by the way, I'll note, come from India, China, and Colombia, which I mentioned specifically because this pretty closely hews or maps onto the demographics of House District 50. And I know that many of my constituents are immigrants themselves, who also came to this country on student or work visas, as did my own parents, right? What we've seen in Georgia and nationally is we've seen American citizens being detained by ICE for completely spurious reasons, despite producing documentation that shows that they were born in this country, right? In one case, a U.S. citizen from Georgia crossed over into Florida, so, first mistake, and he was detained at an ICE facility for, I think, 10 days, definitely more than a week, under completely unlawful grounds, despite producing documentation that he was an American citizen. In other cases that have come to light recently have gotten some attention, American-born children, some of whom have serious medical conditions, were deported to foreign countries without due process and without access to their doctors or their medications. And there's a lot more, right? But I just want to stop here and ask you, Professor Green, before we get too overwhelmed again about concrete action we can look for and concrete action that we as Americans can take ourselves. So the question is, what can the courts do when the president shows again and again that he doesn't care about the law and he doesn't care what the courts say and he doesn't care what the Constitution says? What can the courts do about that? And what can individual citizens do to fight an administration that threatens our community?
So there's a lot there, and I think there's a few things to say. One is, I would say that he is there. There have been some court orders that his administration seems to have defied. He is not saying that he has defied those court orders, and I think that's an important distinction because we're not quite. He's disputing whether he's in defiance, even though it appears, by all measures that he is. If this went up to the Supreme Court and they said, no, really, this is what we mean, and he said, no, I don't care, then we're, as you say, the language of constitutional crisis, I think is kind of laundering that situation through a vocabulary that we're more accustomed to. Now we're talking about an authoritarian system, which is unfamiliar to us, but that's the language that we should start using at that point. But at this stage, if court orders seem to be ignored, you're already starting to see in some lower courts in some of these immigration cases, judges starting to talk about contempt of court, which is the usual mechanism that a court uses if someone who is a party to a case or who's been subpoenaed, for example, doesn't respond to a court order or disobeys it or acts in defiance of it. And what that means is, ultimately you have to defend yourself and say, here's why I didn't obey this court order. And if the court is not satisfied, then the court can hold you in contempt, which sometimes means you get a fine. Sometimes it means there's a criminal referral to the Department of Justice. That gets very complicated when you're talking about the executive branch being the one that's in contempt of court. Sometimes people can be put in prison. And then you get another kind of round of, are you going to defy this court order? If you're talking about executive branch officials, it's extremely rare for executive branch officials to be held in contempt of court because usually they're actually trying to comply with the law. So we'd be in very, very uncharted territory if we're talking about holding someone in contempt and the executive branch is resisting that in some way. Again, that goes beyond constitutional crisis and gets into really flirting, not just flirting with, but descending into authoritarianism.
I have a question from the audience that relates to what you just said. Well, first, let me say that, that sounds bad. And I think normal people would think that if they were held in contempt of the court, like that sounds pretty bad. I wouldn't want to be in contempt of the court, but if
And the
you don't
Department
care,
of
then
Justice
like
lawyers
what?
don't want to be held in contempt either. I'm sure of that.
But if the person who's being held in contempt not only doesn't care, but is insulated in many ways against actions that he's taking, under the auspices of carrying out his official duties, what can happen next? And the question was, who enforces the judge's orders, right? Like if the guy's like, make me do it. Even if they're
Well,
not outwardly saying like, I am defying the court, right? But they're in action defying the court. Um, what happens next?
so the enforcement mechanism would be the U.S. Marshals. The U.S. Marshals are by law are required to carry out the commands of the judiciary. But the U.S. Marshal Service is a division of the Department of Justice. And so you get into very complex territory if the Attorney General were to order the U.S. Marshal Service not to, detain someone, for example, and a court were to order that the U.S. Marshal Service to detain someone, then the marshal would have to decide which of those commands to obey. And that's almost a definition of a constitutional crisis, but meaning there's contrary constitutional commands, and we don't know what the right one is. But here, I think we would know what the right one is, which is, if you're just defying court orders and acting lawlessly, then that's the point at which, I hate to say it, but the usefulness of lawyers runs out at that point, because at this point we're talking about lawlessness. We're talking about an authoritarian, and you know that you respond to that with revolution or with maybe through politics if you're still having elections. But you're into the territory of world historic authoritarian systems at that point. We're no longer in a constitutional system.
There was one case that actually did go all the way up to the Supreme Court. This the person who was deported to the prison in El Salvador, Abrego Garcia, I think is his last name. And I noticed something odd in terms of how the administration was responding to this order. And this is not to parse the language of the decision of the Supreme Court, but it seemed like it was a rare decision these days, that it was like a 0 to 9 decision, instructing the executive branch to facilitate the return of this person so that they could receive due process. And when the administration, in specific, Stephen Miller, was presenting this, they presented the opinion flipped. Do you know what I'm talking about? That he seemed to present it that the court had ruled unanimously in the other direction, which is bananas, right? Because anyone could look this up. So that seems like a step beyond even what an administration that would disagree with a decision would do, and not just to drag their feet or to quietly defy it or to, look for ways to avoid doing what they were told to do, but to present literally the opposite is entering into, gaslighting territory.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's certainly a lot of gaslighting going on. I think there is one of the complications with that order is that there is a kind of procedural point, which is exactly what court um, should these claims be made in, and then there is a question of should these people get should people get due process of law, and so there was a case where the where the government wins on exactly where the location of the case should be, but loses on the court saying unanimously, yes, of course you've got to give due process of law. And I think more generally, you're seeing a lot of statements, particularly by Stephen Miller and others in the White House social media, where they're just kind of I think it's hard to say that they're doing anything other than just defying the court. They're saying, no, we're never going to return this guy. Ha, making jokes about it. The president himself, in an interview with Terry Moran recently, said, "Oh yeah, I could get him back, but the lawyers don't want me to." which is going to go straight into a legal document, and they'll say to the court, look, they're in open defiance of the order. So this is going to come to a head pretty soon because the district courts, the trial courts that are handling most of the details here are pretty obviously quite upset at the lawyers for seeming to defy their orders. And the Supreme Court is going to have to get involved again. And then we'll see if the administration complies or not. There certainly seem to be people in the administration who are kind of raring to resist whatever the courts say. And as you say, that's really lawless. We're in that becomes authoritarian territory if the Supreme Court says try to get this guy back, and you're like, and the president's like, no. There's not really any precedent for that.
But what more can the Supreme Court do? They already ruled 0-9 or 9-0, however you want to.
Well, they're arguing about the
Like, don't
meaning
make
of
me, don't make me come back there. Don't.
I mean, they're arguing about the meaning of facilitate. It may come back in the form of contempt of court, and whether they're actually in contempt, whether they've actually facilitated or not. But yeah, you're right. At some point, the court, you say, doesn't have an army at its disposal. It doesn't have the power of the purse. All it has is its word. And so, if it says things and the president says, "No, I'm not going to do that," the framers of the Constitution, would have said, "Well, yeah, well, of course he will just be impeached if that happens." That's not something the president just gets to do. They were pretty afraid of having a king, and that's the kind of thing that kings do, is tell courts that they can't tell them what to do. So the remedy, the constitutional remedy for that is impeachment. And if you have a Congress that's refusing to do that, then kick them out of office.
I think this part is the most concerning part of all to me personally, but to a lot of people, is that, obviously since Congress is not doing shit, that we look to the courts and the judicial system as the only backstop, as imperfect as it is, and as slow as it is, as, the speed is not as immediately responsive as we would want, but that is what we view as the backstop. So when that falls, I think it's natural to ask as individual citizens what we can do and what comes next. What do you think? Is it the same thing, that public outcry, drawing attention to the issue, making it so painful and unpalatable to continue on this path that they do have to back off? Because we have seen some evidence of backing off on certain things once it becomes clear that the pain is too great. But
Yeah,
the approach to immigration seems like unusually, like they don't feel pain on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're very eager to show that they're tough guys on immigration, and that's, as you say, that's what the president ran on. I think they think that being very, very tough on immigrants is politically popular. I think some of what we're seeing in recent polling is that when push comes to shove and you actually get down to the brass tacks of mass deportation, that doing that requires violating people's due process rights, right? You're going to wind up sending people abroad who have without due process. You're going to end up separating families in tragic circumstances. You're going to end up making it very difficult for people who are even here lawfully to pursue their education, or to want to stay, or to want to come. And that I think it's fair to ask whether that's what the American people signed up for when President Trump was elected. It's one thing to say, yeah, we should be tough on immigration. Another thing to say that we're going to act lawlessly, that we're going to act heartlessly. And so I do think that the last couple of weeks, I think there has been a change in public mood around some of these issues. I don't know how much the administration will respond to that, but I think continuing to put pressure on elected officials, continuing to go to town halls, and if representatives won't show up, then hold them without them, and show that in these very red districts, that people are concerned, that people care, that people want the president to abide by the law. And again, if that Donald Trump, is one thing, and he's in his last term. I will say that as because 3 terms is not constitutionally available to him. Um, and so he may not be that susceptible to political pressure from the electorate, but members of Congress are, and they get elected. Members of the House get elected every 2 years, so that's next year. And so it's very important to show that this is a very unpopular person, and that's what's going to embolden members of Congress. Is if they see 38% approval rating, well then okay, there's a little bit more that we can. That I'm afraid of my hide at that point, but it also means that the amount of pain that the president can inflict on a member of Congress for defecting is less if they've got less political power themselves.
I think part of this little extra that we're seeing on the immigration policy side is that they feel this is a good electoral issue for them. They feel they have an advantage, so they feel a little bit inured from any criticism against it because they for some reason continue to see this as like a slam dunk for Republicans and a losing issue for Democrats. And I do think that maybe Democrats do need to speak up a little bit more about this and not be afraid of the issue, as we sometimes historically seems like we have been, right? So I think that maybe they're not reading the room quite well on this issue in particular, but we also as Democrats have to step up and call out what we see, because I do think that this is well beyond what most voters wanted, even the voters who did vote for Trump. I'm going to ask one last. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, people also look to their political leaders for leadership and for guidance. And if you're not saying that there's a problem here, then why should I say it's if my elected Democrat, who's supposed to be the party in opposition, doesn't have a problem with this, why should I?
Yeah, I agree. One last thing I'm going to ask you, because you do teach at Columbia, is obviously that's been in the news a little bit with respect to the immigration news, is that a couple of your students, not your students, but students at Columbia, have been targeted by ICE and detained. What is the mood on campus now? And I ask that because obviously this is not isolated to Columbia, that we're seeing this all across the country, and this has affected students in Georgia schools as well. So I just ask you, what is the mood on campus and how are students feeling?
Well, as you say, it does affect people across the country, and part of the reason the administration is doing this in the way that they are is in order to scare people across the country and not just at Columbia. But there's certainly anxiety on campus. We have a lot of international students, a lot of people who had their visas canceled and then reinstated recently. And of course, students who have been in fact detained or threatened with detention for political speech. And so there's anxiety about, well, if you can pick someone up for writing an op-ed in the newspaper, totally protected First Amendment activity, then people are scared, scared to leave their homes. At the same time, there's just anger, mostly at the administration for behaving in this way, and this very not just unconstitutional way, but really I'd say anti-constitutional way, which is not just people have a disagreement about what the Constitution means, and it's just being resolved in a certain way. It's the core value of the American Constitution is that you get to engage in political speech without being picked up by a government agent and thrown into a van. I mean, that's if there's like a single principle, that's the principle, and that is exactly what is being defied here. And I think people are just outraged.
I think the fear is real. My oldest son is at college at a state school in a different swing state. And he's in an orchestra at the school. He's a classical cellist, and their orchestra has a international trip that they're taking to perform for 2 weeks abroad. And one of his classmates, another cellist, is actually has decided not to go on that trip with them because it's an international student, and they're afraid about what's going to happen when they try to re-enter the country, right? So this does have real effects on students all around the country, even if they haven't been targeted yet, right? And it's already affecting how people act and the decisions that they're going to make. And I think it's, it's only been 100 days, right? So I am quite anxious, and I'm sure many people are, about what the next 100 days and the next 100 days is going to bring. To respect people's time, I'm gonna wrap it up, but certainly if you have any further questions, do email them to us and we can pass them on to Professor Green, or I'll answer what I can. But thank you so much to our guest, Professor Jamal Green, for leading his expertise and his perspective to the discussion today. If you like Professor Green's words and how he puts them in order and says them, I recommend you pick up his first book, which is How Rights Went Wrong, which I guarantee you will make you smarter, even if reading it makes you feel a little bit dumber, like I felt. He's very smart. You should definitely read this book. Again, I'm Representative Michelle Au, proudly serving Georgia's 50th House District. Thank you so much for spending an hour with us this evening on such an important topic that affects every single person in this country. Do keep an eye out this summer for our House District 50 listening tour, which we're going to launch again. In addition to all the programming and service events we host all around the district and in different parts of the state all year round. If you would like to sign up for our newsletter, please visit our website. All right, high-tech time. au4ga.com, which we spend a lot of time on this newsletter, and we hope it adds value to your understanding of how the state legislature and how national government works for you. I will note that I, for some reason, can no longer find any markers in my house, so I used a surgical skin marker to write this. So this is real on brand for au4ga.com. So please stay engaged, keep showing up, and we will see you all again very soon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Professor Green.